Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is your brother Baraka Blue, and you are tuned into Path and Present podcast. We have a special episode this week, but before getting into it, I wanted to make an announcement. Rumi Center for Spirituality and the Arts has a retreat coming up in Indonesia on the island of Bali over New Year's. This will be a week-long retreat, December 29th through January 4th. And the retreat is a muraqabah retreat. Muraqabah is the art and practice of Islamic Sufi meditation. And this is the second offering of a meditation retreat that Rumi Center is giving, the first being with myself and Adenka Mendes this summer at Dar al-Islam in New Mexico. But this practice involves observing the heart and emptying it of other than the real so that one can draw near to and experience the divine presence. And the retreat is not only speaking about muraqabah, but actually engaging in it. It's meditation, it's silence, it's invocation, dhikr, fikr, contemplation. Also practices such as muhasabah and writing and reflecting and community. And spending a lot of time in nature. The island of Bali is second to none as far as just natural beauty, really deep in the jungle, and we're on a retreat center that is just breathtaking, to say the least. So you're all welcome to join us, and if you're interested in this, you can visit muraqabahretreat.com, and you can also find the link on rumicenter.love. And this is a blessed way to ring in the new year, inshallah. Now, I wanted to introduce this episode and just say a few words about our guest. The guest this week is Dr. Faris Abdel-hadi, who is an author and specialist researcher in the field of Ibn Arabi studies, metaphysics, Sufism, and philosophy. And we speak in this episode about his latest publication entitled Ibn Arabi's Religious Pluralism, Levels of Inclusivity. Now, this topic is one near and dear to my heart, and to be very honest, this was one of my favorite conversations I've ever had on this podcast, and for many reasons. One is that the author, has done such a beautiful job in laying out this conversation and these topics, and these are topics that are very much interesting to me and near and dear to my heart. I ended up embracing the path of La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah through the works of Ibn Arabi. And as someone who had studied many of the world's religions, and particularly mystical traditions, questions of inclusivity and exclusivity, pluralism, abrogation, and truth found in other traditions, it was a question that I really spent a lot of time with. And I think I'm not unique in that. Obviously, this is a question for modern people, because all of us are kind of thrown together, and all of the traditions are thrown open, and we're all in these kind of multicultural environments where we're engaging with people of all different paths and practices, and we can read the texts of the great traditions even without the training that was usually a prerequisite to be able to read the mystical texts of one tradition, let alone all of them. And so it's a very unique time. I think that brings up a lot around inclusivity, exclusivity. And Ibn Arabi, being one of the great mystical thinkers of human history, and someone who wrote a lot about these topics, is really just someone who is beautiful to reflect on his teachings in this regard. So this conversation explores the book, which I had the blessing of reading, and I want to encourage people to read it. And so I'll just allow the conversation to unfold without saying too much more about it. But lastly, I wanted to say, if you value this podcast and these conversations and they're meaningful to you and you want to see them sustained in the world, the best way to support is by becoming a patron on patreon.com/pathandpresent. This podcast has always been community supported, and our intention is to be much more consistent than we have been in previous years. And the way that we can do that is through your support. So there's many tiers as far as support, and for as little as $5 a month, you can sustain this podcast. And there are other tiers, one of them being a book club, where each month I share reflections on one of my favorite books. And this upcoming month, I'm going to share reflections on a book called Rumi's Mystical Design, which is speaking about the structure of Rumi's book one of the Masnavi and the kind of architecture of the book, as well as what he was setting out to do with all the discourses and teaching stories. So if you're interested in that, you can join at that level and have access to that. And there's also, a sustainer circle where we get together and have deep conversations about topics related to the path and related to this podcast. So you're all welcome. And lastly, but definitely not least, I want to thank Sufi Corner, who is a community organization based in New Jersey and New York City that is much aligned with us, and who has hosted me a number of times, actually to speak about muraqabah, and as well as to recite some of my poetry. And they're an organization that does such amazing work around Sufism, Islamic arts, Islamic philosophy, and intellectual life. And they just had our friends Firdos and Sambo there to perform, as well as lead workshops on the maqams and drumming and traditional Islamic music. So they do all kind of things, as well as having many of the great authors and scholars and translators that we've had on this podcast as guests. So Sufi Corner is the sponsor of this episode, as well as this season, and they have very generously supported this endeavor as a way to share the light of our beautiful tradition. So give them a like, give them a follow on Instagram. They're very active, and you get to see all the beautiful programming that they're doing. And with that, please share this episode with whoever you think it might interest. And I pray that all of you are in a blessed state. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. So we're honored to have you, Dr. Faris, to explore your new book, which first and foremost, congratulations on. And of course, the topic is related to Sheikh al-Akbar Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, and particularly topics related to inclusion, exclusion, and other religions, which is a really pertinent topic in today's day and age. And I wanted to begin by just reading a few lines of poetry from Ibn Arabi that you quote, actually, in your paper, that are actually probably, most famous lines of poetry from Ibn Arabi. They begin, لَقَدْ صَارَ قَلْبِي قَابِلًا كُلَّ سُورَةٍ. My heart has become capable of every form. For gazelles a meadow, a cloister for monks. For the idols sacred ground. The Kaaba for the circling pilgrim. The tables of the Torah, the book of the Quran. I profess the religion of love. Wherever its caravan turns, that is my belief and my faith. And one can see how these lines would be very popular, especially in a day and age like ours, a time of multiculturalism and pluralism. So before there's many questions. I've just finished reading the book, and so I have a lot of thoughts and reflections. But I think a beautiful place to start for those, especially that haven't read the book, is maybe you could just lay out the overarching question of the book and what you sought to answer, as well as maybe why you felt drawn to do this, because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this is also your dissertation was on this subject, correct?
Yes. Absolutely. So first of all, thank you very much for having me on your podcast. Jazakumullah khairan, and for the work that you are doing. And yes, you're right. I think this is a subject that is pertinent to many people. I will say though, I find it interesting that you could split the demographic on the number of people who are interested in the subject into two large groups. One group are not necessarily interested in this question, uh, and they're okay with whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides on the topic, right? But then you've got a second demographic, which I fall into, and I suspect other people fall into it too. And that is they have um, a lot of trouble reconciling how do we approach the modern and postmodern age with, I guess, what are the requirements in our religion and reconcile them in a way that is harmonious. To put it simply, some people have trouble sleeping at night with this question. And so that's why it becomes an important question. Um, yeah, so with that background in mind, I also just want to say that I apologize to the future readers who will read this book. It's slightly academic, um, and you are right. This was written as a dissertation and reworked into a book that could be published. Um, but really, I wanted to write something that would be for everyone because everyone deserves to read this topic, uh, and it deserves a readership that can be, you know, accessed far and wide. But that requires time and resources. So that's something I want to look into in future. But given that this is more of an academic work, I have tried to make it as accessible and readable as possible to the layman. So it's just a small caveat. It might require a little bit of effort, but it's rewarding, inshallah. So just to answer your question after this long-winded introduction, what drew me to this topic is that, like yourself, I was introduced to the writings of Sheikh Al-Akbar a while back, and they, and as anyone can see, anyone who is introduced to his writings finds that there is an irresistibly magnetic quality to those writings. And it's not easy to put into words succinctly, but he tends to have an answer to many questions that are relevant to our day and age, and probably for all ages, because there's a very unique quality to him. I mean, there are other mystics, but there's something in particular, particularly unique about him. Uh, I mean, those who have read him will know. So one of those questions is he has a really interesting answer to the question of the existence of other religions and how do we interact with them, but especially as Muslims and especially as the religion of Islam, how do we engage with them? Is there a edifying way to engage with them? Do we simply dismiss them one and all? Do we simply accept everything they have to say? You know, you've got different extremes on both ends of the spectrum. How do we approach this problem in a way that is um, meaningful, right? So he answers those questions. And my first introduction to this problem was reading a book by Professor William Chittick, who is the Don of Ibn Arabi studies in America. And this is from his book called Imaginal Worlds. And so he broaches the topic with a passage from Ibn Arabi that is now famous amongst people who know this issue and who are involved in this issue. And so the first passage I came across was what I call the solar metaphor or the celestial metaphor. Um, I mean, I'm happy to mention it if it's relevant, but other people disagreed with his interpretation because that metaphor suggests that there could be a degree of pluralism in Islam. And other people said, no, you're reading the passage wrong. So I found that quite frustrating. And that was the purpose of the PhD, to figure out how exactly does this metaphor work? What is Ibn Arabi really saying about other religions? Is he pluralistic or not? Is there an in-between ground? And so the PhD was just an attempt to clear away that frustration.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think I've also Imaginal Worlds was one of my is one of a book that I love, and actually as I've mentioned on this podcast in previous episodes, my door into the religion of Islam, or the straw that broke the camel's back, at least, was actually William Shidduch's Sufi Path of Knowledge,
Mashallah.
because it really just opened my horizons. I'd been reading Rumi and other Sufi poetry and loving that, but the metaphysics and the cosmology, and to your point, the way that Ibn Arabi almost had this comprehensive vantage point on existence and all its levels and the human being as it relates to that, it really just, I mean, total, and 20 years later, I'm still just coming back to it in awe. And I think this particular topic um, is of utmost importance because, like you said, some people maybe they're not bothered with these topics, but so many people in our age are. And there tends to be this conception that, okay, maybe there's exoteric religions and every religion claims to be true and claims that the others are false, but then there's the mystics, and they're all saying the same thing and speaking with one voice, and they're transcending that. This is at least a common perception amongst a lot of people in the Western world and the modern world. um, and the interesting thing about Ibn Arabi is that he's almost anyone can find a something from him to affirm their position, because
Yes.
in a certain sense Ibn Arabi, he's not a philosopher, he's a mystic, and so he's a visionary. He's writing from these unveilings and these experiences. He's not writing some didactic like point one, point two. It's really like, and he speaks of that very clearly, that he just writes from pure inspiration. And so in that regard, it's almost closer to poetry than it is to prose. Even his prose works are very poetic, and so you can almost, for that reason, they're not just easy to assume what he might mean. And it may seem outwardly that he's actually contradicting himself, or wait, he said this about other religions and then he said this. And I think you do
Mm,
a really good job of bringing out those those debates and those conversations. And I think, just to give a bit of like autobiographical detail, I grew up in a very, like many Westerners, in a certain post-Christian ambiance. Like I wasn't raised religious at all, but my father was raised Catholic and he went to Catholic school, and he didn't want us to be raised Catholic, my sister and I. And he was really like, let them decide for themselves as they get older. And the reason that he told me that he kind of lost faith in Catholicism is that he was a young boy in school, and what they taught was that, we're right and everyone else is going to hell.
mm,
And
mm,
he just,
mm,
there was
mm.
something in his fitra that just couldn't accept,
Yes.
like, how is that? There's people that are born in China, or there's people that are born in the heart of Africa, or, how can I reconcile this? And even like Dante, is you often consider the greatest, medieval Christian poet. Even
Yes.
he, right, poetically, and he drew very heavily on the Isra and Mi'raj literature. This has kind of been shown, but
Yes.
he mentions that, actually the biblical prophets themselves are in hell. They're in the lower level, they're in the like highest level of hell, but Jesus actually has to come down and save them. So this is a worldview that I think has formed a lot of the perception of Western peoples, whether you're Christian or not, and people just assume that every religion is like that,
Yes.
you know but every religion isn't like that, and not even the other Abrahamic religions. And Islam is very nuanced. And so, and Islamic scholars have spoken a lot about the other in very nuanced ways. And it's not just the marginal scholars. We're talking about like main scholars. And we could talk about Ghazali's position. We could talk about Ibn Taymiyyah. And
Yes.
like Ibn Arabi, like in most things, his position is almost like the most nuanced and subtle. But we can get to that. But I would like to really kind of start this, as you started the paper, the book, with this conception of the solar metaphor. Maybe you could, I don't know if you wanted to read it or just summarize for our listeners what Ibn Arabi, mentions about the solar metaphor.
Yes. So I would be happy to do both. And I think it's just such a powerful metaphor. It is worth reading. It'll take like probably half a minute. So just let me quickly bring that up. It's worth reading. Yeah, so this is from William Chittick's Imaginal Worlds. So this is translation. And so Ibn Arabi says, all the revealed religions, the Sharia, are lights, so they're anwar. Among these religions, the revealed religion of Muhammad is like the light of the sun. Among the lights of the stars, the kawakib. When the sun appears, the lights of the stars are hidden, and their lights are included. So the specific word for this is indarajat, are included in the light of the sun. Their being hidden is like the abrogation of the other revealed religions that take place through Muhammad's revealed religion. Nevertheless, they do in fact exist, just as the existence of the light of the stars is actualized. This explains why we have been required in our all-inclusive religion to have faith in the truth of all messengers and all the revealed religions. They are not rendered null, batil by abrogation. And that is the opinion of the ignorant.
So yeah, obviously there's a lot to unpack there, and I think it worth mentioning for a wide audience that may be listening, and you correct me if you will, if you would like, but I think it's safe to say that the view of history that the Quran gives is that all human beings before this realm were spirits in the divine presence and took a
Yes.
covenant with God to recognize divine unity and to come into the world of multiplicity as a test. And then there's this sense that messengers will be sent to remind human beings of their true nature and of divine unity and the path to realize that unity and to walk the path of light and truth and beauty and virtue. And of course, so from the Quranic conception, this includes every prophet from Adam all the way through the biblical prophets that we know, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, on to Muhammad, peace be upon him, and 20 odd prophets are mentioned by name in the Quran, but the Quran is also very clear that every nation was sent a prophet, right?
Yes.
124,000 prophets were sent to every nation and tribe. So even though the ones that are mentioned are kind of representative of the world that the prophet, peace be upon him, was sent into, they also mention extra biblical Arab prophets, Saleh and Hud, for instance. But the point being here is that by extension, the Quran is affirming that the Chinese had prophets, the Native Americans had prophets, the
Yes.
Europeans, the
Yes.
Africans, and so,
Yes.
and that this sense that everyone inspired with the truth was inspired with the same truth, no God but God, but that they brought kind of different laws or different paths in some of the rulings and the details, but that the essence was the same. So I think that's really important to kind of just lay out for people that are maybe coming to this perspective from, maybe they're not Muslims, for instance, and they wouldn't be aware of that. Now, the second thing to mention, and I'd love for you to unpack this, is that for the normative, I think, stream of Muslim scholarship would say that because the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is the last in the series of prophets and their seal, that he, in a certain sense, abrogates the previous messages. In other words, if you think of a king sending letters, and then the last letter the king says is, okay, you can, all of those last letters were true, but they've been mixed with falsehood, or at least this is my final message, so you can kind of disregard those others to a certain degree and listen to this letter. This was my kind of final. And so from that perspective, the normative perspective of Muslims and Muslim scholars would be that once one hears of the message of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, that it is incumbent upon that individual to follow that message. And even if they were following a previous dispensation or previous prophet like Jesus or Moses, etc. So I just wonder if you might explain to us really what, maybe unpack this solar metaphor and what you think Ibn Arabi might say, or would he add nuance to what we've said in broad detail?
Thank you so much. That's such an excellent question. It's the question I've been wrestling with. So you know how like if you're just an average Muslim and you go through the Quran, you find verses which are like, oh, okay, the other religions are done away with, annulled. It's very clear that there's no other religion. Then you find other verses, and you're like, oh no, wait, it says that these religions are seem to be valid, and this and that, and there's light in this religion and these religions, and so you're like, what on earth is going on? How do you make sense of these verses that appear to be saying two different things? So everyone has their own method. How do we reconcile these different verses? So Ibn Arabi's is by far the most interesting. So that's the one that I look into, and that's the solar metaphor. Um, Shamsuddin Tabrizi, he has a really interesting metaphor for abrogation as well. So he says like the previous religions are comparable to fruits. Like one time you eat cherry, after cherries there's apricots, after apricots there's apples or oranges or marul. Each one corresponds to a different prophetic religion. But when you're eating the fruit, you don't taste the previous one. So the new tasting is canceled out the previous tasting. And that's how Muhammad's religion is. It cancels out the previous tastings. Now, William Chick has translated that passage. So I find it strange when people say that William Chick hasn't, maybe he has avoided the whole topic of abrogation. He hasn't. He's just taken a particular view. Um, but coming back to the metaphor, um, yeah, there's a lot going on in there. But basically, the short answer is that it's this two-step process in the solar metaphor. When the sun rises, you cannot see the stars anymore. But nevertheless, intellectually, through the use of your intellect and reasoning, you know that the stars remain. So this cosmology is quite similar to ours. Now, he's taken another view on a second cosmology, but we can talk about that later. But it's very similar to ours. So the stars remain, but they remain unseen at the same time. The sun's light overpowers the light of the stars. So, in that sense, we have to be able to make sense of how is it that the religion of Muhammad can appear, but then all the other religions continue to remain, but in a cult, unseen way. So it's a two-step process, um, which to me looks like it's fana and baqa, very simply. And so, what is fana and baqa? These are two terms that are very normal in Sufism and Sufi terminology. You can find explanations for them in the Risala al-Qushayriya, which the Sheikh Al-Akbar used to read very often. It's very normative. Um, and so, fana means annihilation. It is the state of annihilation. And so, when a Sufi traveler is traveling to God in his suluk, when he has fana, it's fana fillah. He is annihilated in God. And so he ceases to perceive creation. Or there could be a simpler version where he has fana from his sins. And so he then subsists in obedience. So after fana, there's baqa, which is subsistence. When you are annihilated from something, you must therefore subsist in something after that. So they are correlative terms. They cannot exist one without the other. And so if someone is annihilated from creation, then he subsists in God. Now, it seems to me that this is exactly what's happening in the solar metaphor. Um, Once you look at all these different passages from the Futuhat, for example. So in the first chapter, I go into this problem and go through all these passages. It's quite laborious. And I again apologize to the reader because it's a bit tedious to go through, but someone's got to do it, right? But the short answer is that the religions are certainly annihilated in one respect. That is undeniable. And so that's abrogation. And that's normative abrogation, which all Muslims accept. Um, the religion of Islam wouldn't be Islam without some form of abrogation. You cannot deny the existence or presence of abrogation. It's just inconceivable. Islam wouldn't be Islam anymore. It is foundational to the religion. This is why you have other scholars arguing for that position. So you've got Sheikh Nuh, who is Nuh Keller, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, and you've got other very important scholars, Gregory Lipton, one of them too, of course, because it is the position of Islam that the other religions are abrogated. The only thing is, typical of Ibn Arabi, he'll take a doctrine of Islam that is normative, but then he's got his own spin on it. So it's an affirmation of the foundational doctrine with his own unique take on it. And that is to say, yes, the other religions are abrogated, but they're not. What does abrogation mean? They're not destroyed. They don't cease to exist. Something else is happening. What is that thing that is happening? That's the tahqiq. That's the tahqiq means verification, or it's the investigation you've got to do to find out what's actually happening. Because yes, they're annihilated in one sense, but then they continue to remain in another sense. And it seems to be that the second part, which is the baqa, the subsistence of the religions, that tends to be the part that is either unknown to a lot of scholars or it's ignored by other scholars. So they continue to remain. But the short answer is that they're only annihilated from a state of independence. They are no longer religions in and of themselves, by themselves. They, they continue to subsist, remain under the umbrella of the Muhammadan Sharia. They continue to subsist under the aegis and jurisdiction of the Muhammadan law and of Muhammad. So that means they continue to exist, but in a way that he decrees, in a way that he, so there are rulings. So what ruling does he give for the other religions to exist? And that becomes the question one investigates. So they continue to exist, but through his law. So the stars continue to exist, but through the existence of the sun. That's the metaphor in a nutshell. And obviously, a lot more can be said about that. But I'll just let you comment, see where we take this. But that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I love that you brought in this idea of fana and baqa, this foundational, doctrine of the Sufi that on the path, the ego ultimately goes through various states of annihilation or extinction, with the final idea of extinction to all but the divine unity. But then that the completion of fana is actually baqa, is returning back to multiplicity, but no longer veiled by multiplicity from unity.
Yes,
Uh,
exactly.
and so
Exactly.
there is a beautiful affirmation in that. Yeah, and I think you point out, as you just did, but in the book you go into a lot more detail about how certain people reading Ibn Arabi will emphasize more the fana of other religions and more the baqa, essentially. And you can find ample statements in Ibn Arabi for both. And so um you you talked actually about the sun worshipers and his meeting with the sun worshipers, and that's an important story that you bring in, and I think that's really important, and I want to get there. But I guess, of course, it's very hard to summarize Ibn Arabi because he speaks so nuanced. But it's one thing to accept, for me, uh, when I first read the Quran, one of the things that was so beautiful about the Quran is its universality, is that it
Yes.
affirms every saint and every sage and every prophet and every messenger
Yes.
and every speaker of truth as speaking one
Yes.
truth. It's this really beautiful message in that regard. And that was beautiful to me because I had been studying and seeking in various religions, primarily Eastern religions, Buddhism amongst others, and I had seen immense truth, and it was undeniable that there's immense truth, and in fact, similarities in all these wisdom traditions. And so the idea that one is true and all are completely false just wasn't going to appeal to me. And so actually
No.
the Quranic narrative that they are at their core true. They have truth, even if there's been untruths that have sifted into the religious forms, which again was very easy for me to accept looking around at religion in the world today. So, um,
Just what you said there, I want to bring something in because it's
please.
very relevant. Um, There are a number of ways to incorporate the religions under Islam. The question is, how do we do it? And I think the rest of the podcast can be dedicated to figuring out or explaining how that is so. But you were just mentioning the Eastern religions, right? And just previously, I was mentioning the previous fruits and tastings of the religions, if you like. So that's another Sufi term, dhawq and adwaq. Each religion has their own dhawq. The dhawq does not disappear, but it's got to be incorporated into Islam in a particular way. So one of those ways, the most obvious way, the most explicit way, is wilaya. And that is an entire subject in itself, which really is often translated as sainthood. But really the word means friendship. So friendship with God. But you know what? I like the word saints, so I'm going to stick with saints, saints and sainthood. But really, it's more accurate to say friends and friendship with God. But you have these unique individuals who are the inheritors to the prophets. You have these unique individuals who are in the footsteps of major sages. And so Islam incorporates all of that without exception. So, for example, if you're a Muslim, right, you must adhere to the law and the rulings of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. But you know what? You can have an experience. Another word for dhawq is experience, a spiritual experience that is Christic, that is Christ-like. You can walk on the path of Christ if you like, but it's got to be through abiding by the rulings of the Sharia. It's the same with Moses. You can have this very similar experiences to what Musa alayhi salam, had. And so when the saints do that, they experience the same unique, for example, charismata, miracles, and prophetic character traits that belong to those prophets. So when a saint takes a path seriously enough, he's called, for example, if he's walking the path of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, he's called Isawi, he's called Christic. So then he has the same miracles. He can walk on water. He heals people. It's the same with Musa alayhi salam. When he has illumination, his face shines with light. And he might have character traits that are very majestic. They seem severe, but it's covering an internal core of mercy. But he has like a very possibly tough exterior, whereas the Christic saint sees the beauty in all things. And so you can be like that. And that's all under the Sharia of Muhammad Sallallahu, and it all encompasses that. So there's no reason why you can't have a dhawq, right? That's also Eastern, right? Is there such a thing as a Buddhist dhawq? It's not inconceivable. And this has been looked into in previous centuries. So I do mention the example of a Chinese Muslim scholar named Liu Qi. He's from the 17th, 18th century, from the tribe, the Han Kitab. And he sees no contradiction, including Confucius, in the line of sages. So he would call Muhammad the utmost sage. And then Confucius would be one of the major sages. And then you've got the other Taoist figures who are called worthies. So Lao Tzu is a worthy, for example. And he constructs an entire, not just cosmology, but an entire system that incorporates Neo-Confucian teachings with Islam. So how does he produce this Confucian tasting within Islam? That's the work he does. And it's from the Akbari school without a shadow of a doubt, because he's heavily inspired by Abdurrahman Jami and the works that filter into China. So you can trace these transmissions that go across the entire world. Suhrawardi al-Maqtul, Shihabuddin Suhrawardi al-Maqtul, he's an amazing figure. He was executed, in his early 30s due to a misunderstanding. But in Halab, so he's a contemporary of Ibn Arabi, though they never met. He was part philosopher, part Sufi. You know how you say Ibn Arabi is not a philosopher, right? Well, Suhrawardi was part philosopher, part Sufi. Well, his master was Plato, simply put, under the Sharia of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So he's got a Platonic dhawq. And on top of a Platonic dhawq, he also has a very unique Pythagorean and Empedoclean dhawq, the dhawq of Empedocles, right? Because Empedocles talks about the forces that animate the cosmos, which is called love and strife, right? That is the ancient Greek setting. Well, he reworks that concept into mahabba and qahr. And so you've got these, what he calls unseen lights that the cosmos is created from, and each one interacts with the other in a dynamic fashion through mahabba or qahr, depending on the affinity each light has to the other. And so he has this amazing way of incorporating the other Eastern, first ancient Greek philosophy, and even aspects of other Eastern religions into his system, right? And so those are just two examples. And a third example would be in Mughal India. And that's also an incredibly fascinating topic on its own.
I love that you said that, and I really want to tease out some of these points because, well, first of all, I took a note from one of the passages that you quoted that ties in with sainthood and other religions. So I just wanted to read this because I found this to be really profound and almost get to something that I had been reflecting on myself. So you quote Ibn Arabi as saying, "How many walk upon the earth whilst the earth curses them? How many prostrate themselves upon her, but she does not accept it? How many preachers whose words do not go beyond their lips or thoughts beyond their minds? How many a beloved saint, Wali Habib, is to be found in synagogues and churches? How many a hated enemy in prayer rooms and mosques? Who does this for the sake of that, but reckons he is working for himself?" So this seems unequivocally to affirm this point that you're making, that wilaya, true sanctification, true sainthood, is accessible to followers of other paths. And part of this, it gets to this as I'm just reflecting on this. Often it's stated that the prophets come with, kind of like two messages. There's the path of salvation and then the steep path of sanctification. So salvation is for everyone. They're the broadest net, really calling everyone, strive to do good. When you make a mistake, make Toba, and hopefully in the end, all will be encompassed in the divine mercy. But then there are those that want more. They want to, in a certain sense, ascend to the divine presence in this life. And so each prophetic message has at its core this path of sanctification, of wilaya, of drawing near experientially to the divine. And I think when we think of this raises some interesting questions, because if you think of the broader paths that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi being sent to all humankind and affirming that which came before him, but also abrogating that which came before him, you think about that, but then you also think about the fact that whatever is true is always true. Right. Virtue, in a certain sense, is amazingly ubiquitous, right? That all of the cultures recognize generosity, recognize compassion and forgiveness, recognize justice, recognize these traits, humility, as beautiful, and recognize other traits as ugly, as depraved, such as
Yes.
arrogance or stinginess, or the opposites of the virtues. And so anyone, you could think of someone in a small village in India or in a remote jungle in the Amazon, or you would think of uncontacted tribes of previous generations where people truly strove to walk the path of uprightness and virtue and dignity and selflessness. The idea that because and I know there's Ahl al-Fatra, there's this concept of like, if even this is in very normative discussions in the Islamic tradition, that if people didn't actually receive the message, they're not taken to account for that. I know there's a lot of nuance here, but I think this question of what the ultimate purpose, in a certain sense, of what the prophets came, was to bring people into an experience of divine unity, of this core truth, and that various people have various capacities or preparedness to realize, each one is a vessel that can contain however much it can contain of this divine unity, but that the ultimate goal is that bringing people into an experience, a dhawq, a tasting of this divine unity. And so it raises some interesting questions around, well, if you can attain sanctification, if you can draw near and experience the divine outside of this message, then what does that mean? What are the implications of that? I wonder if you might reflect on that.
Yeah, that's such an excellent question because we tend to assume, or I guess normative Islam might tend to assume that if you're not Muslim, then you're just outside the realm, outside the ambit of salvation, period, never mind sanctification. There is more nuance to that because the whole core of the idea reverts back to abrogation. Abrogation just means that the status of the laws cease to be laws independent of the law of Muhammad. They now subsist through his law. That's abrogation. That's Akbarian abrogation. It does not mean that they become batil. It does not mean that they become useless. So the travelers of other paths and other religions, their path's not useless. It's just subject to his authority and what he has to say about it. And so our job is to go through all the different possibilities that exist to see how they could be included in our Sharia, or what is incumbent upon them. But their paths continue to exist. They don't simply become useless. And what you're saying is completely correct. Like I would agree with that fully. There is something called a Diwan al-Awliya, the hierarchy. This kind of like an institution of sainthood in the unseen, in the invisible realm, right? Which oversees the works of the different saints. So they're the ones who kind of like overlook and watch what's happening with the other spiritual travelers in the world, and provide them with assistance as is needed. And there's a very interesting, so what you've said reminds me of a story that's mentioned by Michel Chodkiewicz in his book, The Seal of the Saints, where Abdul Jilani takes his student with him through a weird portal, kind of like, and then they go to a different place, and they see a man with a large mustache, for which the readers of at that time would know he's straight away he's a Zoroastrian. So that's a Zoroastrian saint. So he's coming, and there's a man who's shaving off his mustache and donning him with the Islamic cap as he ascends to a new rank of sainthood. He ascends to a new office in sainthood. And then Abdul Qadir Jilani explains that that man who was shaving his mustache was Al Khidr, right? So Al Khidr continues to be the invisible watcher of all the spiritual travelers on the path. And Sheikh Al Akbar mentions that in chapter 36 of the Futuhat. Um, and so that's really interesting. Um, I mean, the whole question of sainthood is interesting because that's an entire door to the question of relative pluralism. Um, yeah, and obviously a lot more could be said
A lot
said
more could
said,
be
said about, but
said. Yeah,
yes,
and I mean, if you read the Meister Eckhart's or the Shankara or Buddhist sages, Taoist sages, I don't want to overstate that they're all saying exactly the same thing, but there is a sense of experiential realization that there is one ultimate reality that is being itself, that is the foundation of being, and that each one of us is somehow the selfhood that we identify with in our normal state is illusory, and that our true selfhood has a mysterious and ineffable relationship to that ultimate reality.
yes, yes, yes,
and
it
and
is.
and so all of these discussions then, and you look at just like the, kind of like eight philosophical systems of India, Indian philosophy, versus what Buddhism diverges from them. All of them, they're like these philosophical, highly nuanced conversations on the nature of the self in relation to ultimate reality, because there's this sense that they all experienced. And so then they take these various perspectives. And I think even from Ibn Arabi's perspective, you can almost reconcile all these perspectives, because one thing that maybe we could get into, it, maybe you could elaborate for our listeners, is that Ibn Arabi has this beautiful kind of way of saying that every perspective has some validity and some truth.
Yes,
And in a certain sense, that, like, if there was no truth in it, it wouldn't exist. By virtue of it existing, is that there at least has to be some truth there, and
exactly.
that he talks about maqam la maqam, the station of no station, right, or the
Mm,
point no point, where you're actually able to
yes,
somehow see all perspectives and affirm them in their level. That's another important thing about Ibn Arabi, and this is why people maybe sometimes confuse him, is because he's saying something may be true on one level and not another. And so he could be speaking from one level and affirming this, and then the next time it sounds like he negates that and affirms something else. But I think it seems like levels of perspectives and levels of being and levels of even the human self and subjectivity are important, that there's certain realities. So I wonder if you might elaborate on that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's an excellent point. So this reminds me of here. Let me roll this up because this is relevant. So this reminds me of a discussion on Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, right? So yes, all beliefs. So now we're getting to the question of i'tiqadat. Not necessarily aqidah, but i'tiqadat, which translates into beliefs. And for our viewers, or listeners, sorry, it's probably good to get into the root meaning of the word from aqada, which means to tie a knot, right? So you're tying a knot in something, but when it comes to beliefs, you're tying a knot in the heart. So it is a knot in the heart which will accept a particular belief that it adheres to, and it will deny another belief that contradicts that belief. So all people have their i'tiqadat. Now, each knot is relatively true because each knot corresponds to al-haq, the truth, the real Allah. Because, as you said, it has a correspondence in existence just by virtue of existing. And this is getting into his metaphysics. We can even get into some of the Quranic verses because he says, وَقَضَىٰ رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدَ إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ. That's a very important verse. And which translates into, your Lord has decreed that. Now, the uh, ordinary way of translating that verse is, your Lord has decreed that no one should worship anyone but him, which is a correct way of interpreting that verse. But there's a more literal reading, and Ibn Arabi takes literal readings very seriously as part of his hermeneutics, which says, your Lord has decreed that you actually don't worship anyone but him. So no matter what you are worshiping, that object of worship is always going to be Allah in the end, no matter what, whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, it's always him. Uh, ad infinitum to infinity, whether you realize it or not. Um, Even atheism is a form of that. The question then is so the Emir Abdul Jazairi also has a beautiful um, page on that, a beautiful chapter on that, when he says, Allah, he's this, but he's also not that. He's this, but he's also not that. He's this, he's also not that. If you say what Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah say, he's that, but he's also other than that. If you say what the Magians and the Zoroastrians and the Jews and the Christians and all the dualists say, he's that, but he's also other than that, right? You can never fully encompass him, but you can never be fully wrong about him either. That's incredibly important. Even his commentators don't always grasp that subtle point, which I find. Because with Ibn Arabi, the implication is quite clear. If they're relatively right, then that has to have a correspondence to their akhirah and the sharia in some way. Um, it does not mean that Allah approves of all methods of worship. It's just an ontological statement, but it's also more than an ontological statement. The word ontological statement means this is how it is in reality, whether you know it or not. You're always worshiping Him, or you're always interacting with Him through His divine names in some manner or the other. Um, so all things worshipped are in reality actually Him. So the question which then arises is, okay, uh, does Allah approve of all methods of worship? And the simple answer is no, He does not, even if it is Him in fact. What Ibn Arabi gets at is, okay, He does not approve of all methods of worship, but are there rulings in the Sharia that permit people to worship through their particular method of worship or not? And that's what I get into in some detail. So you're just talking about these amazing individuals who have different forms of enlightenment. So they are traveling a particular road. And when they reach the end of the road, they find something, right? That is a form of ijtihad. I mean, we can get into the whole question of ijtihad right now, because that's a very important mechanism by which the other paths, travelers, thread, and the other religions and philosophies are incorporated under when they're non-monotheistic. They're incorporated under the ruling and the mechanism of ijtihad. So when a sage finds a certain form of enlightenment, um, one scholar, Michel Chalkovitz, understands that from a Quranic verse which says, they have a bayyana min rabbihim. They are upon a bayyana, which is a kind of a clarification or a truth upon their Lord. So they are to be left alone because they've received a a bayinat that is true for them at their level. There's another word as well. I'm just trying to think of it. I'll mention it when it comes to my mind. But ijtihad is basically it's rooted in the Sunnah itself, right? And it's a word that we know from jurisprudence and fiqh, because the major founders of the schools of law are mujtahidun. That's how they founded the school of law. And you must be qualified to have certain qualifications to create a school of law. But it has a root that goes way back into the Sunnah itself. That's not rooted in a particular school of law. So Rasulullah says in the hadith that the one who struggles and he is correct in the question he's investigating, he gets two rewards. So إِذَا أَصَابَ لَهُ أَجْرًا, he gets two rewards. But if he makes a mistake, he still gets one reward. So you can be mistaken on an issue. That's how in Islam we disagree with other aqidas and aqaid, but you can be mistaken, but you have the right to worship Allah through that path on which you are mistaken, because that the path of ijtihad is sacro, sacrosanct. Is that the word? Sacrosanct? Yes, that's the word. It is sacrosanct. You cannot tell someone not to worship Allah through that path, and that's well established in fiqh. People just don't realize how that applies to other religions too. But in fiqh, it's established. So, like, if one mujtahid says, this is my ruling on an issue, the second mujtahid cannot tell him that he's not allowed to use that ruling, because he arrived at that ruling through his ijtihad. In the other religions, people who arrive at a particular form of worshiping God or a particular way of understanding God are permitted to worship God through that manner. Now, some people might say this is really far-fetched, right? Like, how is that possible? The hadith couldn't have meant that. Well, here's the thing. Other ulama say, listen, ijtihad is only permitted in what is called the furu' of the sharia, which are called the ramifications, the legal ramifications of the branches. So I can have certain ijtihads and into the question of let's say, like, how much water you use for wudu, or the question of salat, or the question of is this particular thing valid or that particular thing valid. But you can't have ijtihad in what's called the usul, which are the foundational principles of the religion. And that's a very reasonable argument to make. Otherwise, we would get into some very tricky territory. So the foundational matters of the religion, the usul, include things like what is Allah, what is His nature, what is sifat, what is the nature of prophethood, and so on and so forth, into very foundational questions. But here's the thing: for Shaykh al-Akbar, he says very simply, ijtihad is permitted in the usul and the furu'. He says, for us, that's my madhab. My madhab is that ijtihad is permitted in both ways, and that has very profound implications. And so an example of that is to be found with the sun worshippers that Ibn Arabi meets in his stay in Anatolia in the more mature period in his life. And we can talk about that a little bit if you like.
Yeah, I'd love, maybe you could get into that. Maybe you can just explore with us what he says about the sun worshippers.
Sure thing. So he is now in his travels, and Ibn Arabi travels a lot. And I think that has something there's something to say about the way he has a very expansive outlook on life because of his travels. But as opposed to someone who hasn't traveled and takes a more parochial view. So he is traveling throughout Anatolia, and he tells us that he is traveling throughout Anatolia, but he doesn't say which country exactly. So we don't know where he was, but it was somewhere in modern day Turkey. And then he comes across where he says, a large group of people he found worshiping and prostrating to the sun. He tells us this explicitly in chapters 69 and 72 of the Futuhat al-Makkiyah. So he recounts this experience, and he says that he sees many of them. So I would assume that he went through some kind of settlement or even a town. And then he said he was invited to have lunch with one of their scholars. So he sits down at his lunch table, and they're having a meal together. And then Ibn Arabi says, "Listen, I'm just going to ask you straight up. Why are you doing shirk? Why are you associating your worship of God with the sun? Because that's an interesting question for me as a Muslim. And it's we find that quite odd because I've seen many people prostrating towards the sun. And then the Greek scholar has a very interesting response, right? And this tells you that Ibn Arabi takes responses of people very seriously, because you could approach this from a different angle and be skeptical about what someone else is saying. Ibn Arabi isn't usually like that. If you tell him that I'm doing something, uh, then it means that you are doing that thing. Um, so he says, hashala. In Arabic, it's hashala, which means you can translate it to something like God forbid or no way. No, 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 no. I'm not worshiping the sun for its own sake. And God is only one God. Allahu ilahun wahid. He's just one God. But what we have done is that our scholars have investigated what the reality of the sun is and what benefits it brings to our world. So you should know that already when he says the word investigate, it means that he's done some kind of ijtihad, or the scholars or the people of intellectual abilities preceding him have done this investigation. And so he says, when they looked at the sun, they could see what light and benefits it was bringing to our world. And so they said that we know that the sun is just a poor servant of God Almighty, but God would not have given it this exalted position if it did not bring all these benefits into the world. So if God is exalting it, and the word used in Arabic for that is ta'zim, which is really important because it's found in the Quran as well. So it's got a Quranic root, ta'zim. So if God exalts the sun, right? And another word for ta'zim is venerate. So if God exalts the sun, then we also decide that we should exalt the sun just as God is exalting the sun too. And then if Barry says, he said this to me while we were at his lunch table. And so that passage, which is from chapter 69 of the Futuhat, it's called the prostration of ijtihad and of love and longing, which is a very interesting way of entitling that of naming that prostration. And so what that means is very clear. If they achieved that prostration and method of worship to the sun through ijtihad, then they are permitted to do it. Although we can say simultaneously that we find that's incorrect to do so for many reasons. It is still incorrect, but they are permitted to do it. That's another method of inclusion.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating because now we're far afield from the world of even like people of the book or, normal
Yes.
monotheistic,
Yes.
exchange. We're talking about what would probably be termed almost like pagan uh,
Yes.
practices. And now that also brings up for me um, a section in the book that was really fascinating, and I hadn't come across this passage about the origins of polytheism.
Mm.
And I'll do my best to recount what I understood from what you shared, and you correct me or highlight other nuances if I don't bring them out, please. But it seemed to be like 2 points that Ibn Arabi was making, and if I understood correctly, the first was that um, in the realm before this, in the spiritual realm, alam al arwah, that each individual was witnessing the divine reality, experiencing divine unity, and of course, this is an ecstatic experience of the ultimate reality, gazing directly without a veil.
Yes.
And then when human beings are then removed from that realm and enter into the realm of separation and multiplicity, become veiled from that almost like the trauma of that separation
Yes.
is that
Yes.
there's a degree to which people fixate on things which maybe reflect something of that light, right? They almost like
Yes.
seeing some of that light being reflected in this tree or this stone or this river or this lake or this individual.
Yes.
Um, and so there's a degree to which Ibn Arabi is saying like that they fixate on this thing almost like as a substitute out of the trauma of being separated from this ecstatic vision of ultimate reality. And almost like he seems to have like a lot of compassion for someone, because it's like what a trauma it is to be
Yes.
separated from that. That was the first, but then there's another point that he made, which is also interesting, is that he mentions that he seems to bring out that, like, look, in a religion like Islam, and we could say other religion, you give examples from other religions, but there are things which are venerated. Now, we don't think, let's just take the Kaaba. Muslims prostrate wherever they are towards the Kaaba, 5 times a day. And if you go
Yes.
to Mecca and you see them, you're witness, like, and from an outside observer, and you even like these, people that dislike Islam will even say, like, oh, you're worshiping that box.
Yes.
You're worshiping that box. And one
Exactly.
might say, well, what's the difference between that, which is stone? It's a
Yes.
stone versus some
Yes.
idol. And we also he also mentioned the black stone, right? Which,
Yes.
the Muslims venerate a specific stone,
Yes.
which is the right hand of God, as the Prophet sallallahu alaihi called it.
Yes.
And we could talk about, these symbols of God, right? Like Safa and Marwa, are symbols of God, right? And so Ibn Arabi seems to say that those people essentially maybe have separated the symbol from what it symbolizes, or they kind of like fixate upon the symbol, and they don't see through the symbol to what it is meant to connect us
Yes.
to.
Yes.
um so there's that. And then, there's another point that I don't think he brought out, at least in this passage, but I also wonder what you might say about this, is reflected often, and in that, if you look at a religion like Hinduism,
Yes.
which very clearly, obviously there's a plethora of divinities, and that's why when, the Christians came and said, look, worship Jesus, they're like, sure, well, he can also be in the pantheon of deities. Right? It didn't really work.
Yes.
But
100%.
the
Yeah.
idea here is that if you really get to the scholarship, and really those that are learned, they will say, but ultimately these are facets or aspects of the one, that there's ultimately only one God, one reality. Now, this is, of course, a degree of like multiplicity of gods that Muslims are going to be uncomfortable with. But it's very easy to look at this as almost like that they've almost like personified different or different, what we might call like Asma Allah al-Husna, or sifat,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Names
Yes.
or attributes
Yes.
of God, which
Yes.
we don't say Ar-Rahman is separate from al-Latif or al-Adl, the compassionate is different from the gentle, or the just, or the different 99 names, because we understand that these ultimately refer to the same unity, right? They're kind
Yes.
of like, they indicate relationships. There's no multiplicity, in the essence, obviously. Anyway, these are subtle things a little bit, but I think from that perspective, we could understand how it could happen that over time people come to almost like concretize these
Yes.
attributes into individual um, deities. So I don't know if Ibn Arabi ever mentioned something like that, but anyway, I know I just said a lot, so I'm curious your response.
No, he totally talks about it, and that's such a long subject. But he totally talks about that. Abdurrazzaq Qashani explicitly talks about it when he's discussing the people of Noah, Qawm Nuh, alayhi salam, and says that their gods are just personifications of the divine names. Like literally, these are the word tajassud, like they're embodiments of those names, right? And so he's fully aware of that. And there's so much that could be said about this. It reminds me of the Quranic verse, another one, which is very important to the subject, which is أَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهَ اللَّهِ. So wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. Now, as a mystic and as a Sufi, so an Akbarian Sufi, he takes this verse very seriously, and he says quite explicitly. And then there is the commentator, his name is Lahiji of the poetry of Shabistari, and he's even more explicit about this. And Sheikh Al-Akbar says, look, um, Allah Ta'ala says that, first of all, wherever you turn, there is the face of God. And then he interprets that to mean, i.e., the reality of God. So you can find the reality of God wherever you look. Now, it is obligatory to believe that. You cannot say that his face is absent in some place, because that's just disbelief. You're now entering into the problem of kufr, which means to cover over. So you covered over his reality by saying that it's not present in some place. That's unacceptable. He has a presence in every place you look to. But nevertheless, the verse continues: turn your face towards the Qibla of the Kaaba, Shatrat Masjid al-Haram. So that's the direction that's been specified for you. So there's Haqiqah and Sharia combined in that one verse. Now he says, in the same way that it is obligatory for Muslims to only pray towards the Kaaba, it is obligatory for them to believe that the face of God is wherever they turn. And if he doesn't believe that, then either this is kufr or he's ignorant. He's jahil. And so Lahiji is even more explicit. And he says, oh, you Muslims, what is being said here is that if you do not recognize that the reality of God is present in this idol, then you are performing a form of kufr and disbelief and covering over yourself, right? You have to believe that some aspect of the reality is being reflected wherever you are turning. And so that's very clearly present in many religions. There's more to say about this, but I just want to make a distinction because you're alluding to the concepts earlier of veneration. And so there's also ijtihad. Those are two distinct concepts, and they're very interesting because they have the capability of including two layers of worship, right? So that's it. So that's in the Quran and the Sunnah. So there's a verse in the Quran that's about Rahbaniyya, and you would have come across that in the book as well. So the verse on Rahbaniyya, which is 57:27, says, وَرَهْبَانِيَّةٌ ابْتَدَعُوهَا وَرَهْبَانِيَّةٌ ابْتَدَعُوهَا. Rahbaniyya, they invented it. Now, the word Rahbaniyya is normally translated into Christian monasticism, which is the correct translation. But when you combine it with that word ibtida'uha, they invented it. The verse, and so through Ibn Arabi's lenses, the verse is alluding to something more than that. And that's the path to the sages when they don't have a clear sharia given to them. They are permitted to invent their path. So that is the path of inventing a spiritual way in order to seek God. And so the verse continues, وَرَهْبَانِيَّةٌ ابْتَدَعُوهَا وَمَا كَتَبْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ إِلَّا ابْتِغَاءَ رِضْوَانِ اللَّهِ. And we did not prescribe that method of worship for them, except they were seeking God's pleasure. So إِلَّا ابْتِغَاءَ رِضْوَانِ اللَّهِ, this illa in Quranic grammar is called al-istithna. Now, there's two kinds of, so the word istithna translates into exception. So it's, except to seek God's pleasure. So that's an exception. There are two kinds of exceptions. There's a joint exception and there's a separate exception. So that's istithna mutasil and it's istithna munqati'. Now, if it is an exception that is a joint exception, it means it is joining the same subject to what came before it, and they're both talking about the same subject matter, or it's the same genus. So in this example, if it's a joint exception, then the way it's translated is how they invented it, and we did not prescribe it for them. But so the only reason we prescribed for them was so that they could seek God's pleasure. Therefore, it's a form of revelation, and it was prescribed for them. That's the joint exception. If it's a separate exception, it means we did not prescribe for them, but they went ahead and they started seeking their own way to find God's pleasure, in regardless. So they have no revelation, and that's accepted from God as well, right? So that is the path of veneration. They wanted to venerate God. So Shaykh Al-Akbar gives you three kinds of prostrations, right? In one chapter of the Fatahat, chapter 369 of the Fatahat. So he says, there is a prostration which a created being does on God's command to another created being. So where on earth would you prostrate to another created being on God's command? That sounds weird, but no, that's what the angels did. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, told the angels, bow down to Adam. But they were bowing down to Adam, but not worshiping Adam. They're worshiping the light that was within Adam, the light that was Allah. So they were not worshiping the body itself, but they're bowing down to the body, right? So the one who does that, he's felicitous. he attained salvation because that was God's command. There's a second type where someone bows down to another created being, but not on God's command, and he's worshiping that other that other created being. Then Sheikh Al-Akbar says that person is wretched. Like, for example, the Meccan polytheists who are bowing down to their idols in rejection of the messages of the prophets, specifically the Sharia of Muhammad. So they're wretched, or they're damned. But there's the thing is, interestingly enough, there's a third category where people are bowing down to another created being, not on God's command, but neither are they worshiping it either. And he says that's called rahbaniya ibtada'uha. So then God accepts that from them. That's a third kind, and that's called veneration. So it's very interesting because he will use this example in different places in the Fusus Hakim and the Futuhat, where you can see that there are people who are venerating the object of prostration, but they're not worshiping it, right? So the Greek scholar seems to be alluding to that. This Greek sun worshiper scholar seems to be alluding to this idea. And you can find that easily in Buddhist concepts, where you are venerating a particular object which seems to be an idol, but it's considered to be empty. So there's the concept of emptiness in Buddhism. And so that leads into veneration. That's not worship, properly speaking. That's just veneration, right? Greek Orthodox iconography, that's venerating the icons. And Sheikh Al-Akbar talks about the the iconography of the Greek Orthodox Christians in chapter 36 of the Futuhat. And he says that's veneration, that's not worship, properly speaking. Then you have the question of worship, properly speaking, which is excused when it's done through ijtihad. So you've got two paths there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, and it's interesting that in the case of Buddhism, there didn't seem to be any statues of the Buddha for the first 400 years after the life of the Buddha. So it seems that there was actually a prohibition around making representations that that but that they invented them later. So that's an interesting point. So a couple of things that this brings up. I mean, there's so many directions we could go here, but I wanted to just mention, like you mentioned this ijtihad, and from some of the passages that you quote in the book, it seems very clear that for Ibn Arabi, he seems to have this sense of if someone is truly trying their best to find the truth and live
Yes,
according to the truth, that Allah forgives such a person for the limitations of what they arrive at, even if they don't
absolutely.
arrive at the total truth. But the thing that he seems to say is the people that are really in trouble are those that aren't actively seeking the truth. That it seems to be almost like a spiritual sloth, where they just kind of like
Yes.
they don't even strive for truth. They kind of become complacent or become ambivalent about truth. Maybe you could say something about that. Did I understand that or state that correctly?
No, that's a very important point. Sheikh Abdul Ghani Nabulsi also talks about it as well. So if you are, the question is, are you capable of reaching truth or not? Are you capable of reaching a certain degree of truth that is within your power, right? So that brings other Quranic verses to mind where Allah Ta'ala talks about, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا ما وسعها. Now, as Muslims, we tend to read that in a weird way. We say, "Oh, Allah will not give you a problem that's bigger than what you can handle." That's not a tafsir. That's an ishara. So, without discounting what they're saying, it's like, yeah, that could be the case. That's not the first meaning. The first meaning of the verse is that لا يكلف الله. يكلف taklif. Taklif is He does not charge you with a command and a prohibition, except with a command that you can carry out, or a prohibition that you can avoid, right? Um, that is taklif. So every person who has been given a command from Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, that one would have to see whether he's capable of carrying it out or not. And so your average Muslim is capable of carrying out all the commands of the Quran and the Sunnah. And then there's other verses in the Quran that allude to that as well. But there's other people. So Ibn Arabi mentions this, who don't have that ability for various reasons. So a really good example, the simplest example, is the Ahl al-Fatra. They no prophetic message in its complete form reached them. So Someone like that says, "What do you want me to do about it? No complete message reached me. So you're excused because it's not within your power to find that complete and wholesome prophetic message. There are other people in this world today who find this topic overwhelming. How capable are they of sorting out through all these problems? And then you're saying that they have to be accountable for it in a severe manner in the akhirah. That sounds weird. So I'll share with you a personal anecdote on the same topic because it's so relevant. Um, there was a nice lad me and my friend knew in university. He went to University of Durham, and I visited him in Durham, and he was a Christian, and he was exploring different religions, and so he was learning about Islam and Christianity, and so one time we found him somewhat depressed, and he says like I don't know what to do. Like if I pick Christianity and it turns out Islam's right, I'm damned. And if I pick, the other way around, then I'm also damned if Christianity is right. So I don't know what to do. So someone like that, you're not being asked to do the impossible. You're being asked to do what is within your power, and you're going to be judged in accordance with what is your power. There are people who don't have time to investigate these deep questions. So you do what you are capable of doing it. So we this discussion you brought up earlier about pre-eternity, right? It also gets into the question of like, look, this is way too big for me to answer. I don't know what to do about it. I'm going to go to someone else. Oh, I've got a local priest. I've got a local imam. I've got a local rabbi. I'm going to go to him and see what he says. So Ibn Arabi talks about that in that very same chapter. So you've got to ask. So he calls him mufti, which is so interesting. He's talking about a non-Muslim now, not a Muslim. So this is a non-Muslim mufti. So you go to this non-Muslim mufti, right? If that's what your religion is, you're a Jew, you're a Hindu, whatever it is, and you ask him, listen, Muslims are saying one, two, three, four. What's the truth? And then because he's supposed to be more knowledgeable than him, then he gives him his answer. And then once you have done that, you have discharged your obligation from the obligation that was set on you. You have discharged it because there's another verse in the Quran that says, if you don't know, ask Ahlu Dhikr. If you don't know what the answer is, go ask the ones who know the answer. And then Ibn Arabi gets into a very interesting discussion of why the Ahl Dhikr are the Ahl Quran as well. So when this polytheist, in Ibn Arabi's example, when this polytheist who is a muqallid, so the word here is muqallid versus mujtahid, right? Muqallid tends to carry a slightly pejorative term, but not everyone agrees that it carries a pejorative term. It just means a follower, right? But sometimes it carries the meaning of someone who's blindly following, right? So if someone ceases to use his intellect, which he is capable of using on purpose for an unacceptable reason to do with his shahawat, his hawa, then that's unacceptable. But there's other people who are not capable of undertaking this difficult task. So when the polytheistic muqallid asks his mujtahid leader, is there more than one God? And then the Mufti gives his own reasons saying, yes, there is more than one God, and here are the reasons. He discharged his obligation. He is now excused. And guess what? If this is a mujtahid giving this answer, he is also excused. So both of them are excused in that respect, if so long as he is a mujtahid. But he does talk about categories of people in the Ahl Fatra. Not all of them are excused. He says if there are people, for example, who reach the conclusion that there is more than one God, or that this person is an atheist, for example, but it's not through ijtihad, it's not through trying to find out what the right answer is, he will be held to account for it by God, or he's damned if it's through some other reason that is normally connected to one's shahawat, his lower base desires. It could be to maintain a position in society or whatever the reason might be. You will be held to account for it if you are in fact capable of obtaining an answer of some sort. And then one could say that you are always held accountable to the extent of your capability. Then that's a fair statement to make as well.
I mean, these topics are really so nuanced, and I think, like you said, there's two kind of people, and one person is like, I want it black and white, tell me this or that, and for them, Ibn Arabi is probably not their guy.
Yes. Yes.
And then there's other people that are drawn to the an understanding that of subtlety and nuance and it's perspectival knowledge, that there's all these reflecting vantage points. And for them, I think these type of people, I think a lot of artists in particular, creative people, are really drawn to Ibn Arabi.
Yes.
I once heard the Alex Gray, I don't know if you know him, he's a very famous visionary artist in America. I heard an interview
No.
with him, uh, and he said, you should check him out. You would like his work. It's really, really interesting as far as visionary art. But I heard an interview with him once, and he said, my favorite author in human history is Ibn Arabi, right? So and and the interviewer was like, that's a pretty amazing statement. Tell me about him. And then he just said that, like, the vantage points and the perspectives and the nuance. And then they said, well, who's your second favorite? And he said Rumi. So I thought, I mean, he's outwardly not a Muslim, but he was drawn to these perspectives. And it
Yes.
just also brings up to me, Rumi says in so many poetic lines, but even in his writings, in his lectures, Fihi Ma Fihi,
Yes.
that everything that is loved is Allah. The
Mm.
beloved is always Allah, whatever name you give it. It could be mother, father, husband, wife.
Yes.
It could be beautiful sunset, beautiful face. It could be wealth. It could be power, status.
Yes.
Whatever people
Yes.
love is Allah. In other words, it is the reflections of various names and qualities of Allah. So if we seek wealth, we're seeking, ar-razaq, we're seeking the
Yes.
sustenance, we're seeking
Yes.
the everlasting, we're seeking the infinite. If we love beauty, inna Allaha jamilun yuhibbul jamal, Allah is beauty itself, and we're seeing the reflection of that beauty. If we love justice, even like a lot of atheists deny God, but they're working for justice in the world and working for all these causes, right? They're loving
Yes.
al-adl. They're actually worshiping al-adl, even though they say there is no God.
Without knowing it. Yes.
Yeah. And so, and I once heard, actually, someone told me that William Chittick mentioned that when he meets an atheist, he says, I don't believe in the God you don't believe in too. Right? Because, in other words, there's a sense of what people are denying is often a very limited conception of the divine reality. It's not,
Yes.
they're not actually denying um the al-awwal wal-akhir wal-zahir
Yes.
wal-batin, like
Yes.
they're not, our conception is so vast, the first and the last and the inner and the outer and the expander and the contractor and the light itself. And anyway, these are some concepts. Of course, Ibn Arabi also has that beautiful line which I love. He says the arif, the knower, never hears a poem or a song
Yes.
or a riddle or a panegyric that isn't about God. Um, so this idea, and it's funny, my Alu Damini, who I think you probably know, beautiful scholar and beautiful human being, who we've also had on this
Yes.
podcast. Him and I have this thing where we send each other back and forth Sufi commentary on pop songs. So like you hear like some pop song that's all about love and the beloved, and you
Yes.
know,
Yes.
no matter what the intention of the person writing it or their vantage point, that there is a reality to what they're talking about is the divine beloved. And so
Completely.
I think these are really important perspectives to bring in. So I don't know if you have anything to say on that, but the last thing I wanted to say and kind of almost ask, in what you've come across for Ibn Arabi, because I could hear a listener who listens to this and says, okay, I hear all that, and that may be helpful. But what do you think Ibn Arabi would say to someone, who was a Christian, or was a Jew, and who came to his lesson? Would he be encouraging him to embrace Islam? Or, from this perspective, you could say, well, if everyone's doing their ijtihad and there's truth in every perspective, even if it's somewhat limited, and people can be saints in every tradition, you understand the line of questioning I'm going down.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. I want to get back to what you were mentioning earlier, but just to answer this particular question, Ibn Arabi has clear criticisms of the other religions. That doesn't mean that he's a 100% pluralist. He's not. I use a term that's called non-reductive pluralist. That's what he is. He clearly has criticisms that are in line with normative Islamic beliefs. One of them is obviously that the other religions are distorted. from his perspective. Now, you can still find God in that distortion, but it's a distorted perspective. He will still maintain the normative view, which I share as well, that Muhammad SAW brings the pure Deen al-Qayyim al-Hanafi, the pure religion, which was lost to the other prophets. So you're going to have other problems and face other complications. That would be our argument if you were to simply ignore Islam, right? So it's not an encouragement to commit apostasy. It's not an encouragement for people to leave Islam in any way, shape, or form, but it is for people who are trying to wrestle with deeper existential questions in this world, and then this will hopefully help them find some perspective on that. He's very clear as to what the problems with the other religions are and what those problems result in. I'll just give you a very quick example. It's in the book as well. It's in the beginning of another book, the Ijab al-Bayan. He probably mentions it elsewhere too, but the Ijab al-Bayan, and he says, look, when there's a verse in the Quran that mentions that the other prophets, like for example Musa and Isa alayhi salam, or say Isa alayhi salam to be more specific, knew that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was coming. So they actually preached belief in Muhammad through the scriptures. So there's a verse in the Quran that says, Isa alayhi salam says, I tell you about the coming of Ahmed, who will come after me. So it's from their religion. If you don't accept that, you're rejecting your own religion. That's one of the arguments made by Shaykh al-Akbar and by normative Muslims. You'd be rejecting their own teachings, which is clearly harmful. So you would be entering into a topic called the polemical tradition, which Ibn Arabi is clearly a part of. He shares of any discussion, especially with the other monotheistic religions, will always result in some sort of a polemical discussion in the polemical tradition, where we are going to disagree about very clear and obvious things. So this is in no way a validation of things that, as Muslims, we clearly disagree with. The other thing we'd say is that when Isa alayhi salam comes back at the end of time, he abolishes the jizya, which is one of the mechanisms for maintaining Judaism and Christianity, for example, and Christians and Jews. He abolishes that. And so Ibn Arabi himself says that a lot of Jews and Christians will become Muslims at that time. And then he also says that, look, well, he doesn't say this. Actually, one of my teachers says this. He says that the whole point of the jizya is that you are not sure about whether Islam is a true religion or not. So you're permitted to you're permitted to remain upon your religion based on your uncertainty, and you have reasons for that uncertainty, right? Which is why you're excused. You have an excuse. But make no mistake about it. The shukuk you have, right? We don't confirm the shukuk. We confirm you upon your shukuk, which are the doubts. We confirm you upon your shukuk. We don't confirm the shukuk themselves.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that and offering some nuance in that regard. It's interesting. I remember reading, this is years ago, so I don't remember and I forget which book it was, but Guy Eaton, famous English convert to Islam, he actually used the solar metaphor, but he used it in a more modern cosmology where he said, Islam is the sun for me, from my vantage point, the planet that I'm on, and other religions are stars. He said, but I acknowledge that from another solar system, another galaxy, that Islam is a star and their sun is their religion. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes. So that view is taken from Sayyid Hussein Nasr, and from Sayyid Hussein Nasr, it's taken from Riyadh Shuan. Okay. So Shuan's a whole other subject, and the issues of perennialism. Gregory Lipton critiques that line of thinking in the third chapter of his book, Rethinking Ibn Arabi. I don't get into it, but I've seen it, and I am aware of it. Ibn Arabi doesn't really talk about other solar systems, but he has talked about how the cosmos is moving, right? And so it doesn't have an actual center, like within itself. Like in our solar center, yes, and in our solar system, yes, the center is the sun, and he says that, but in the entire cosmos itself, it doesn't have a center. right? So it might be possible to make that argument. Gregory Lipton hates it, and he says it's totally wrong. It inverts Ibn Arabi's view. I'm ambivalent about this view. I'm not totally rejecting it, but I don't totally accept it either. What I will say is that if it is possible that the other solar systems have their own suns from their own perspectives, if that is possible, it does not negate their obligation to respond to the da'wah of Muhammad, irrespective. When we talk about the other religions, that's part of the issue of abrogation. The obligation to respond to his message still remains. And then there's something I call the doctrine of excuses. If for some reason that someone hasn't responded to it, they can be excused. That's something that Gregory Lipton has not looked into at all, but it's a major part of Ibn Arabi's teachings. But the basis of the teaching, which is normative Islam, still remains.
That's beautiful. Thank you for saying that. And it reminds me that, in Imaginal Worlds, I remember there was, a passage from Ibn Arabi that William Chittick translates, and I'm paraphrasing because it's been some time since I last read that. But Ibn Arabi said something to the effect of, I want mercy and compassion for all beings, and I
Exactly.
am a weak human being. Like, what about Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim?
Yes.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or recall that. Yeah.
He's got dozens of those kinds of statements. His whole Futuhat, every other chapter and page, really every few pages is something to do with Rahma. So Rahma is an absolute core doctrine of Ibn Arabi. If you've not grasped this doctrine properly, you've not grasped it. It's that simple. Or if you don't like it, then you just disagree with him. Yeah, he says many things about it. He says that we are creatures of love and hawa, and if it was in my power, I would eliminate pain from the entire universe, which reminds me of the bodhisattvas. I would do it if I could, but Allah Ta'ala, He instituted pain for a reason, so it's kept. But if I had the ability to, I would do it. And so this is an allusion to his role as the seal of Muhammadan sainthood, which one can respect, whether one accepts that position or not, as being the ultimate inheritor of the legacy of Muhammad. And that's an allusion to another verse of the Quran: we have sent you not except as a mercy to all the worlds. So Ibn Arabi wants to be the same for not just human beings, but the whole creation. So he says, Allah Ta'ala created me to be as a pure mercy. And so thank God that, I'm one of those. On the day of judgment, the Arsh has pillars, like 4 pillars that turn into 8. So there's a pillar for pure mercy, there's a pillar for mixed wrath and mercy. My pillar is the pillar of pure mercy, and thank God for that, because that's what I am. Is a rahmatan mutlaqan. And so he says, on the day of judgment, I will intercede for anyone who comes within my eyesight. Anyone I see on the ground of the day of judgment, I will intercede for that person, and I will continue to do it until I remember the dignity of the Anbiya and stop and remember that they still have to perform their intercessions before I can do anything. But that's what he is. Like anyone I see, I will intercede for him. And so everyone is always on a journey back to Rahma, no matter how you look at it. What difficulties and obstacles you encounter on the way is a different story. But the end result is the circle. The beginning was Rahma, which is the beginning of creation. And so it ends the way it began, which is Rahma. So if people were created from Rahma, they'll end in Rahma without exception. And so that's a whole other subject as to how everyone is encompassed by Rahma. He takes it from the Quran, well, Rahmati wasi'at kulla shay, right? Well, and then the Hadith Qudsi, Rahmati sabaqat ghadabi, my mercies outstripped my wrath. And that's another interesting subject, by the way, because he personifies the divine names, right? And it's in the Hadith even. He says sabaqat, which means outstrips. It's a term you use for horse racing. So it's as if someone makes a mistake, and then the all merciful and the one who is severe in his wrath are given a chance to go get that person. And so they race one another, and it's the most merciful who wins out. That's the hadith. So then Sheikh Al-Akbar, he personifies that, which makes a very interesting connection to the Hindu deities as well, or Greek deities, or the polytheists, right? But that's a whole other subject, because whereas the polytheists say that these are different essences, right? We say, no, they're different names of one essence. But the things you're talking about, they're real, but it's different names for one essence, right? And that's a whole other subject. So he says that everyone will experience mercy. There's a mercy, especially after the coming of Muhammad Sallallahu there's a mercy that we experience in this world. There's a mercy that we experienced in the grave. There's a mercy that we experience in the barzakh. There's a mercy that we experience in the resurrection, and there'll be a mercy that is experienced in the fire when sinners are taken out of the fire, and there'll be a mercy experience for people who remain in the fire. And I don't know if you're aware of this topic, this subject, but the worst of created beings who remain in the fire, like Iblis and the Dajjal and Abu Lahab and Abu Jahl and Qawm Lut and Qawm Salih, and these people who remain in the fire, they after a while, the pain and torment ceases to exist, and they experience the activities of the fire as bliss. And so everyone is going to bliss, one way or another.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I wanted to ask you about that actually, because I read a book that I think was, I'm forgetting the author unfortunately right now, but it was comparing, essentially eschatology and other religions, non-Muslims and their fate in the thought of Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn Arabi. And it mentions, okay, so Ghazali's position is that almost everyone will leave the fire. Not almost every Muslim, almost every single human being. It's just like almost like he's reading from the scripture that almost there it remains.
Yes.
But there's very few that will remain in it eternally. Ibn Taymiyyah's position being that the fire is not eternal and that everyone will eventually leave the fire. Ibn Arabi's opinion, as is characteristic of Ibn Arabi by now in this conversation we found, is the most nuanced, which is that the fire is eternal, as you point out, but that the punishment of the fire is not, and that it will be actually turned to a type of like sweetness eventually for those in the fire, but they will remain, if I understand, veiled from God. And so I wanted to ask you about this because from my very limited perspective, my reading of this was always that is not the greatest punishment and the greatest pain being veiled from Allah. And so even if on one level you say, okay, the punishment stops, but you're still veiled from Allah, that is this not itself the greatest punishment? I wonder if
That's
you would think
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that.
absolutely. That is an absolutely excellent question. You know what? I think that's not an easy question to answer because you're asking a, a question in which there's some disagreement about whether the people of the fire are veiled from God or not, right? So, for example, Sheikh Abdul Nabosi takes the position that they're not veiled from God. And so when they witness God, they have a vision of God, they have a witnessing of God, that's when their pain stops for Sheikh Abdul Nabosi. And they experience sweetness in the vision because nothing can overpower this tremendous vision of God. For Ibn Arabi, the vision's not required. The pain can just stop when Allah decrees it to stop, when it's time for it to stop. He has one passage which I learned from Sheikh Abdul-hadi Miftah. Sorry, Sheikh Abdul-hadi Miftah. He pointed out, I think it's like chapter 371 or something like that, the Futuhat, 370 something. But basically, the people who remain in the fire, they had to have done some good in this world, like the worst of the worst of humanity. So what'll happen is when they go into the fire, the gates will close. The gates will have these apertures, holes in the gates where the light of God shines through in accordance with the good deeds they used to do in this world, even if it's few. They get a witnessing of God through that, to that extent. But Ibn Arabi has in another passage where he says, listen, it's not possible for the people of the fire to witness God. And then he gives his reason. He says the reason that they can't have a full-on witnessing of God is because they were people who disobeyed God in the abode of obligations, which is where we are right now. And then he says, well, when mercy's property is activated and it spreads over everything, then it's not from mercy for God to show his face to them, because all they can feel is shame when they see him for all the wrong they did in the world. So that would cause them more torment. The torment's period has come to an end. So they will not have that same witnessing that the people of paradise will have. It's not possible, because that would just mean torment for them, which might be which might uh, be reconciled with the other passage where they might get glimpses of God through the apertures of their own good deeds. It's called the makarim al-akhlaq, by the way. That's also another sharia called the makarim al-akhlaq, the acquisition of good deeds. So that they might have that to that extent. But like what you mentioned reminds me of a passage that I think would be good to read. So let me, with your permission, just find it for 1 second. Yes, because it's relevant to this point of now we're talking about the vision of God. So that's called the beatific vision. And then, so when the people of paradise take up their positions in paradise, and it's time to witness God, they go to a place that's called it's kind of like a white dune, al-kathiba lil-ru'ya. And so they take up their places in accordance with their spiritual ranking positions and how much of God they can take in when he unveils himself. So then he unveils himself to them, and then they receive as much light in accordance with the beliefs they used to have in this world. So if you only had one belief, you obtain one light. If it's two beliefs, it's two lights. And when we say beliefs, we're talking about, did you affirm God in someone else's belief? So I'll just read that passage out because I think it's so relevant. So it says, Bismillah, when the people have alighted upon the dune of visions, and the real subhanahu wa ta'ala has disclosed himself in an all-encompassing self-disclosure in the forms of beliefs, surah al-i'tiqadat, in that one single self-disclosure, for it is one as a disclosure, but many to the diversity of divine forms. When they see him, all of them, down to the last person, becomes dyed by the light of that self-disclosure, and each one appears with the light of that form he witnessed. So he who knows God in every belief, then he has the light of each belief. And he who knew God in one specific belief, he will not possess anything except the light of that particular belief. And he who believes that God does not have the property of tanzih or tashbih in his being, then God is as he is in himself. Then he has something called the exclusive light, which is not known until that moment. And it will not be known whether he is higher than the one who encompassed all beliefs, or whether he will be at the same level as him. You see, so this is an important point to bring out for this whole podcast, which is that Ibn Arabi's concept of the diversity of beliefs has a suluki element. There's an element of suluk in it, because when you acknowledge God's presence in the existence of other beliefs, you reap that reward on the Day of Judgment. On the Day of Judgment, there's a hadith. It's a really interesting hadith. It's called Hadith al-Tahawwal, when God transmutates himself into different forms. And that hadith, by the way, is in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. So that is a canonical hadith. People don't know what to do with that belief because it's weird, right? Ibn Arabi is the only one who really knew how to spell it out, because that's exactly what it is. When people are resurrected, they go through different stages on the Day of Judgment. One of those stages is when God will appear to them in a form they don't recognize. So then he'll say to them, I'm your Lord. And they'll say, no, you're not. We're going to wait here until he actually comes. So then he goes away. Then the second form comes and says, I'm your Lord. And so he said, yes, you are our Lord. But then he transforms himself into the first form that they denied. So he finds that very important on the Day of Judgment, so that you don't stand in what's called in the place of denial. And you don't deny God, because he transforms himself into a form you don't recognize. Now, what is the form you don't recognize? It's the belief you denied. It's the belief you denied. There's no other explanation. The belief that you said, this is not God, he can't be present in this form, he can't be like that, this isn't him in any way, shape, or form, then you don't witness that on the Day of resurrection, and then you actually deny him. And then that carries on into paradise. When there's the beatific vision, then you don't obtain the light of that vision.
Yeah, I'm so happy you mentioned that hadith. It's really interesting, and I really love that section of the book where you point that out. And there's so much there to reflect on that it's almost like overwhelming. Um, One of the things I wanted to ask is if you might elaborate anything that Ibn Arabi mentions about the beatific vision, because one of the things that Imam al-Ghazali mentions so beautifully is that in each well, he mentions that the place that the common expression of which is Jannah is the garden, but the expression of the khas, of the elect or the elite, is gazing upon the divine countenance, right? That really, he says very clearly, like, that's what the garden, it really is for
Mm,
those that but he mentions something really beautiful, which is that you basically, that, like, if you think you would ever get tired of gazing upon the divine reality, like, you have not understood anything because he
yes,
says it's not static, it's dynamic, in the sense
yes,
that each
yes.
moment you will come to witness more fully and experience more deeply and understand more vastly that reality.
Mm,
And he said and it will continue going on for eternity, because there is no end to it. It literally is the infinite, the absolute, the eternal, the ultimate. So there's no, like, okay, you've encompassed it. It's like it becomes more ecstatic, more blissful with each moment. And the Quran references this when we talk about the fruits become more delicious with every bite. Whereas in this world, the first bite is the best, the second a little bit less delicious, and the more you
yes,
eat, the less
yes,
delicious things get. But
yes,
the
yes, yes, yes.
garden, it's the opposite of that. And I recall that Ibn Arabi does speak about almost like fana and baqa in the divine witnessing, almost
Yes,
like coming, you repeating, like almost like you lose yourself in it, then you're brought back to yourself, and that's almost like a completion, is that you come back to yourself. So
yes.
I'm curious if you might want to reflect on any of that.
So there are several reflections, and thank you for bringing that up. That's so interesting. Um, yes. So the same concept exists in Christianity, where experiencing God is a series of new beginnings, just one new beginning after the other. They also have that. But then there's a verse in the Quran that says, لا يبغون عنها, that means Jannah, لا يبغون عنها حولا. They will not seek to leave it. And that is exactly the reason you pointed out, because it's always a series of new beginnings. Each new bite of an apple is new and fresh and unrepeated, which is a reflection of one of God's attributes. And that is, He is al-wasi', the vast. And it's a reflection of the way the cosmos functions, because the cosmos cannot subsist for more than one unit of time, the smallest unit of time you can think of. It cannot subsist beyond that. So what happens is Allah creates it, then it's destroyed, then He recreates it in the next nanosecond, or what's the smallest unit of time? He recreates it then so fast you don't realize it. So that means that the pencil on my desk uh, is now a different pencil in the next moment, and it's still a new one after that, after that, after that. So there's a hadith relates that when Rasulullah says that Allah does not get bored the same way you get bored. He does not get bored as you should get bored, because everything's new to him. And so when you're in touch with, in tune with the divine reality, you see things coming into existence as new each and every single time. It might look similar, but it's different. It's new. So there's a verse in the Quran, لا يبغون عنها حولا. Now there's a TV show which was around a while back. I don't know if you ever watched it. It's called The Good Place. So The Good Place basically was a, let's call it, a postmodern take on the afterlife. These characters find themselves in the afterlife, and which can be the good place, which is kind of like what we call paradise, or in the bad place, which is hell. But it's a much more diluted version of paradise. It's a much more diluted version of hell. But they find themselves there. So then the whole series is about trying to get into the good place. They eventually get there, but what they discover is that, listen, I can only go to Paris so many times before I get bored. So then one of the main characters says, "Is I just want to leave the good place and just find myself obliterated into oblivion." So then the makers of the good place, they make this door. He walks through it, and just kind of like his particles are dispersed throughout the cosmos, because like there's you can only do so much in the good place before you get bored out of your freaking mind. So I love that the Quran is the book that contains everything for all times and all places, because it says that we've left nothing out of this book. So it says, لا يبغون عنها حولا. They will not seek to transfer from it, because what you described wasn't paradise.
I love that. That's very beautiful. It ties back to when you mention this hadith where people reject God when he reveals himself or manifests himself in a particular
Yes.
form. Ibn Arabi speaks about the gods of belief, and even you would say for Muslims that say have this aqidah, and but his point is that even amongst the Muslims, like everyone is in a certain sense like projecting their conception of the divine, but by the fact that any conception is a limitation. Even when you say God is transcendent beyond and God is greater than everything, there's a degree to which you're limiting, because anything you say is, again, we're talking about the ultimate, the infinite, the absolute. Even these words are in a sense limiting, right?
Yes.
And so it seems that he's saying like everyone is worshiping almost like the god of their projection, even like you might say like an idol worshiper or someone with incorrect aqidah, they're worshiping something they project. But even if we say someone on the prophetic way, there's still like a sense where each individual has their limiting and limited conception of that which is unlimited. But that in a certain sense Allah is compassionate and merciful, and almost like reveals himself to them in that conception. And we talk about ana anda dhanna abdi bi, I am in the perspective or opinion of my slave.
Yes, exactly.
And so maybe you could speak about that.
So this is called al-ilah al-makhluq fi al-i'tiqadat, or al-haqq al-makhluq fi al-i'tiqadat, the real who's created in the forms of our beliefs, or the God who's created in the forms of our beliefs. And it's very simple. No one can know God as he is in himself. So we can only know him through our own perceptions of the world. And Ibn Arabi takes that very seriously, because then there are shari'i consequences drawn from that. Now, we can't know God except to the extent of our own selves, right? So there's another saying, a Sufi saying by Imam Junaid, that says, the color of the water takes the color of the container. So the water represents the divine disclosure of the way God appears to you, and the container is you. So you color the water in accordance with what your container is, the shape of your container, the color of that container, the height and width. You shape the water. You colored the water yourself. And so your understanding of God is never going to be correlated with the absolute reality. It can't be. It's not possible. So the absolute reality is like Al-Ahad. He says, وَلَا يُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادَةِ رَبِّهِ أَحَدًا. Right? That's the last verse of Surah Al-Kahf. So Sheikh Al-Akbar says about that verse, one of the means is not just don't worship anyone besides God. It means don't, in your worship of God, associate that worship with the divine name Al-Ahad, because Al-Ahad rejects you. Al-Ahad does not accept any other one. You can't know what Al-Ahad is, right? So you can know the other divine names, but Al-Ahad, no. So when you're worshiping a God, you're worshiping what is called your Lord, who is the manifestation of a divine name. That's what you're worshiping, right? And so each God of created belief has a relative truth, and each one has a relative falsity to it. Which is why he says in the Kitab al-Ajwiba, al-ilah al-makhluq fi i'tiqadat يحتاج إلى الميزان الشريعة. يحتاج إلى ميزان الشريعة. This God who's created in the form of beliefs is, when you worship him, you are in need of the scale of the Sharia to decide what you may do with this God or not, right? But in terms of reality, it's true. So because of that, God responds to you in the form of your belief, and he kind of like works with you in your belief. That's exactly what the sun worshipping issue is all about, right? Because then Sheikh Al-Akbar says in the second passage of chapter 72, وَكَذَلِكَ اعْتَقَدُوا, and that's what they believe. Um, it's not a coincidence that he writes that. It's also in the Fusus al-Hikam. وَكَذَلِكَ اعْتَقَدُوا, that's what they believed. So God responds to you with the obligations that are incumbent upon you in accordance with your belief. It's not just that here's the Sharia, here's the beliefs you have to have, thank you, bye-bye. You either believe them or you don't. It's also, okay, my beliefs determine my perception of reality. In fact, I may not necessarily understand reality the way you understand it. What proofs do you have that my understanding of reality is less less accurate than your perception of reality? There are rational argumentations, and that's completely valid. I'm not denying that at all. You know, kalam has a place in scholastic disputation with other faiths, but from an experiential point of view, it's very hard to prove to me that your experience of reality is better than mine, and vice versa. So God works with you in accordance with the way you perceive reality, and that becomes shara upon you. He says that in several places. That's precisely why. So it's kind of like, okay, if this is the way you perceive reality, then this is what you should do. Or if this is the way you perceive reality, then that is what you should do. And he does that a lot. And so the Sharia contains that entire gamut, that entire spectrum of divine experience. So Sheikh Al-Akbar gives an example of Fathat, where he says, like, okay, we were talking about tanzih and tashbih earlier on. Tanzih means transcendence. Tashbih means similarity and immanence. So some people are like, I can't relate to God unless he's transcendent. Like, don't talk to me about Sky God, Sky Daddy, right? That's a bogus God. Don't talk to me about him, right? And there's other people who are like, I don't know what this invisible God is because he seems absent. I need a God I can see. And that's where idolatry comes into it, or other forms of iconography comes into it. So he says the Sharia takes into account the entire spectrum. So there's a verse in the Quran that says, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ, there's nothing like him if you want to be transcendent. Then there's another verse that says, I experience divinity everywhere. So that's for you. And still yet, there's a third verse and a fourth and a fifth that corresponds to each person's experience. He says, I am the God who's perfect in every perfection, who's not quite absent, but he's perfect in every way possible. There's a verse for that too. You know, they've not measured Allah with his true measure. And then there'll be another verse who says, I am the God who's close. Okay, he's closer to you than your jugular vein. Al-Hablu al-Warid. And so on and so forth for each and every person. The Sharia contains everyone. And the Muhammadan saint is the one who puts each thing in its place. He says, for this person, that verse, for that person, that verse. Each person can recognize God in the Sharia, but the Sharia will tell you how to use it. That's all. You have to be obedient towards the Sharia. Even if, like, you have a Sharia that belongs to a different law and it's encompassed by Muhammad's law, right? But you still have to be obedient to a Sharia. Or if you have an excuse and you're doing ijtihad because there's no Sharia, right? And you're doing some other form of worship, that becomes permissible. But there has to be a ruling that takes it into account. But it will take into account. You don't just tell someone. So the story of Rumi and the shepherd and Moses, right? And the shepherd says, God, I want to comb your hair, remove the lice, wash your feet. Moses says, what on earth are you doing? And then the shepherd cries and runs away. And God says, listen, he was worshiping according to the way that he understood. And for me, that was okay. His aqid is wrong, but I like that from him. I like his passion, the burning fire in his heart. I like that. So that was acceptable for him, right? I mean, that was a bit of a tangent. I'm trying to see remember where we left off. But that's how you approach the problem of beliefs and i'tiqadat. They're not dismissed. They have a place. If you're a Muhammadan saint, you will recognize that, and you give each thing that has a haqq its haqq in accordance with its haqq. Because the Muhammadan saint is the one who experiences all reality, and its deepest form is at the center of the circle, and can see all points of the circumference, right?
I really like that, and I really love that you mentioned, this suluki aspect, or this the wayfaring, this traveling, this ascension up the mountain of experience. Because unfortunately, a lot of the discourse around religion in the modern world is almost like it's just beliefs, like it's very almost like you know sense of like believe and be saved, almost like Protestant, kind of thing, and
Yes.
And unfortunately, a lot of the superficial critiques of religion is like, oh, you get a box, and we believe this, and you sign up for the whole thing, and then it's over, and you turn your mind off it, and you don't
Mm,
think after that. And it's like
no.
there couldn't be anything further from the truth,
Yes.
because in thinking about this, and unfortunately, the way Islam is taught to a lot of people is also kind of
Mhm.
like this. It's like you get the checklist of do's and don'ts, and then you're either good or bad. And it's like it's transactional, and that's so superficial. And
Mm,
it's just like you say,
mm,
this isn't like some like Sufi thing. This is canonical. I mean, just look at the Hadith Nawafil as one example, which suffices this point.
yes.
Which is that the servant draws near by nothing more beloved to me than what I have made obligatory, and then continues to draw near by nawafil, extra acts of devotion, hatta uhibbu, until I love them. And when
Yes.
I love them, I am the seeing with which they see, the hearing with which they hear, the hand with which they grasp, the foot with which they walk. This is talking about wilaya ultimately, because the beginning of that hadith says that, I wage war on anyone who harms my wali, my saint,
Yes.
my
Yes.
friend.
Yes.
And so then it talks about how you attain wilaya. I mean, this is in Bukhari and Muslim. This is not, and this is more mystical than whatever Halaj said or whatever Bayezid said.
Mm,
So there's a reality that, like, the point here though is you get the foundation or the scaffolding, these teachings about reality that you can teach a child, and then you plunge into that yourself, and you walk the path, and you
yes.
traverse, and you try to purify yourself of the illusions, which are those, you know in a certain sense, things that you identify with that are illusory, or those character traits, because it really does come to, takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, as you mentioned. It comes of like qualify yourself with the qualities of God. There's almost like
Yes.
a it's almost like you can't perceive reality until you become a certain way, right? You actually
Yes.
have to, there's like an ontology to the psychology, right? And
Yes.
so
Yes.
so I think that's really important to emphasize, is that, I mean, this is really what tasawwuf, Sufism really emphasizes. Unfortunately, for a lot of expressions of Islam in the modern world in the last couple hundred years have really like de-emphasized this, if not outright denied it. And it leaves people with, I think, a sense of flatness and emptiness
Exactly.
in religion. So I think it's really beautiful what you're bringing out. And I almost, that kind of brings me to this thing, in a lot of, even amongst the people of tasawwuf, traditionally there was often, even though Ibn Arabi's teachings were very much mainstream through the poetry and through the art and architecture, and even through the, definitely through the poetry, and then
Yes.
through, just various shuyukh kind of conveying to their murids in a simplified way some of these teachings. But there was often this kind of caution around directly reading Ibn Arabi until you got to a certain
Mm,
point of spiritual
mm,
maturity. It's very common amongst various turuk, not all, but you see it in a lot of the texts of the masters having deep reverence for Ibn Arabi, but
yes.
saying, unfortunately, for people at a certain point, it can be harmful actually to their suluk.
Yes.
Um, Now, I have my own thoughts about this. I've thought about this a lot, as it relates to the modern world and the kind
Yes.
of situation we're in now. But I
Yes.
just wanted to invite your thoughts on that.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much. So, there is a truth to the statement. Not everyone can approach Ibn Arabi. Um, he can be quite confusing, and if you don't have like a good background in his metaphysics, or even in some of the sciences, basic sciences, you can mislead yourself. But having said that, though, we're not living 300 years ago, 400 years ago, where thoughts and ideas were relatively confined to one's locality, village, country. Um, and there wasn't like a great deal of like transmission of ideas the same way there is today, right? Today, it's a whole other story. I mean, you've got how many new ideologies and thoughts and concepts, and like there's Nietzsche, there's Freud, there's Jean-Paul Sartre, there's existentialism, and so on, so forth. Um, Derrida, I don't know who else you want to mention, and they are super challenging, aren't they? Like if you're an average Muslim, and especially evolution, the question of evolution, even certain spiritual group being exposed to other spiritual gurus and masters, you're up against some serious intellectual superweights, right? And then you want to tell people don't read Ibn Arabi? He's the guy you need to either stand up to them or to dialogue with them and make sense of what they're saying, so that you don't lose your faith altogether or you get lost in their teachings. You know, uh, that might have been the case a few hundred years ago. It's not the case today. He was sorely needed, and we are witnessing the consequences of really banning his writings for the past century, right? I mean, his books were banned in Egypt for a while in the 70s. Like, there's a whole court case about whether Osman Yahya could continue to publish the Futuhat or not, continue his work on the Futuhat. This was in the 70s, and what was happening in the early 20th century was that with the rise, now we're getting into colonialism and stuff, right? But with the rise of the new superpowers and technology and the incoming of wealth and capitalism, the Muslim world experienced like a deep shock, saying something's not right and we're getting left behind and we're getting screwed over, excuse my language. So this was the beginning of science and rationality and really the enchantment, being bewitched by science and rationality and especially technology and capitalism technology. So a lot of Muslims said anything that contradicts science and rationality has got to go out the window. So out with this mysticism nonsense, out with it. And then you've got the rising groups of Salafis and Wahhabis and groups that are not very amenable to these kinds of teachings. And so the Sunni Muslims, this is the opinion of one scholar, the Sunni Muslims wanted to appease them, said, okay, listen, we don't want to fight you, but so we'll just, out with all this mysticism and stuff. We won't teach Ibn Arabi. And we were all the worse for it.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, that is my experience. And if you live in a, traditional medieval village where you have the village saint and you can go to him and, like you're studying and he says, don't read this until you get to a certain point. I get that. But and it's not even the West anymore, it's the modern world, I mean, it's
Yeah.
just, recently in Cairo where I lived and studied in 2008. And then there was such a lag between like what the young people were doing here and the young people were doing in Seattle or San Francisco, where
Yes.
I grew up. But now it amazed me. The same new shoes, new Nikes that just came in San Francisco are also
Mm.
popular here. There's no lag. And the same music
Mm.
that just came in, that the newest hip
Yes.
song in San Francisco
Yes.
is also the young kids here. There's no
Yes.
lag, there's no difference. And it just wow, that's in 15 years that happened.
Yes.
And so, but yeah, I mean, so it's not really just like the West anymore. It's like almost that's
No.
anachronistic to even speak like that. It's just this modern thing. And I mean, yeah, you talk about the school system and just the ideas people are exposed to. I'm 100% with you. It's not like the time when, when Imam al-Haddad was writing in the Book of Assistance, like
Yes.
Hamu, like stay away from these kind of books, until, like I think in that context, absolutely. I wonder what he would say about our context. I really do wonder. And you mentioned that, it's amazing again, like the fact that people will marginalize Ibn Arabi, but you could argue very strongly that no one was more influential than him
Yes.
in the last 700 years in Islamic intellectual life. I mean, just to take one example, as you know, like Dawood Qaisari,
Mm.
he basically created the Ottoman school system. And he
Yes.
was just a direct, like in the main, inheritor of the school of Ibn Arabi, and wrote the most famous and popular commentary, as you know, on
Yes.
the Usus. And so it's like, this was not like the Ottoman Empire was kind of like an akhbari empire
Yes.
intellectually
Yes.
as far as the
Yes.
whole school system. So these kind of things are really important for people to understand.
Abdul Ghani Nabulsi was a major scholar. He wasn't some fringe Akbari weirdo. He was in the mainstream, and he used to teach Ibn Arabi the Futuhat outside the maqam of Sheikh Al Akbar to a whole crowd. But it was through his sharh and tafsir, if you like. Yeah, there's so many things that could be said about that because he was the norm. Like
Mm,
in Yemen, for at least a couple of hundred years, like he was the norm. Um, Abdul Karim Jili's teacher Jabarti would not take you on as a student if you didn't have a copy of the Fusus al-Hikam.
mm,
It's amazing how history works in that respect. And then people, as you said, like how would they respond to him today? Like the Egyptian novelist Jamal Ghitani, who passed away shortly, um, he said that Ibn Arabi saved me from a depression. He saved my life, actually. And a lot of people will mention something similar, like during the 1967 war with, you know, but when Egypt lost, he went through a depression. His father went through a depression. It was the beginning of the Futuhat, and he described it as like a lightning bolt that struck him. Who has that power except the word of a saint, a saintly word? It's wrong to deny people that the power of that saintly word. And I know another uh, lady, and she's like, you know, Ibn Arabi helped me the night before my exam, my master's exam. I saw him in a dream, and to me, he's like my Baba, he's like my father, and many people have that connection. It's very wrong to deny people the connection to saintly figures, the awliya. Um, it's like emptying out the core of a religion, and you've got a husk. Walaya, for me at least, Walaya is the lifeblood of any religion, Islam included. Without this lifeblood, it becomes like a walking zombie. You need Walaya. It's the foundation of a religion. It should be enough for people to know that like Nabuwa ends in the next world, but Walaya continues through the name of Allah Al-Wali, which is an eternal divine name. So we are only harming ourselves by discarding the tradition of sainthood and mysticism that we've inherited. It's really the bedrock of the entire religion, for me at least.
wow, it's really beautiful. And, I know we've been speaking for over 2 hours, and very selfishly, this conversation is so interesting to me. And just to sit with someone who's spent so much time reading, Sheikh Al Akbar, it's really a treat for me to just be able to engage. But I don't want to be too covetous of your time. I want to honor that. And maybe there's a way for us to speak more and maybe have another opportunity. There's one last question that actually came up as we were speaking, and that's not exactly. I don't think it's mentioned in your book, but I wonder if you might have some thoughts from Ibn Arabi on this, and it ties back to something we mentioned about, for instance, in different Hindu schools, they have a sense of like ultimate, Advaita Vedanta versus others. So that this idea of like non-dual completely, that the self is an illusion, or the self is the ultimate reality. And then, of course, the Buddhists saying the self is an illusion. And then other schools, like the dualist schools, kind of saying something like, well, the idea that the non-dual school is almost like self-realization, that the center of that Atman is Brahman, is like this ecstatic experience that it's all is one. But the dualist schools would say like that self-realization, you have that, but it's almost like a limitation compared to the realization of adoration of the supreme one. And like that's
Mhm.
far more ecstatic than just whatever you realize about your own nature and your own reality. So I guess what I'm asking, and I know this is a deep conversation, we should probably have another conversation about this, but
Yes.
how do you think Ibn Arabi might weigh in on a conversation like this?
SubhanAllah. You would have so much to say. It's impossible to summarize it in just one answer. But one might say is that it's less important what the actual ultimate reality is than what your experience of the ultimate reality is, because you can't know your Lord except for yourself, and He knows Himself, knows His Lord. So the question is, okay, based on what you've learned, what are you doing about it? How are you responding to it? That's the more important question. Regardless of what it actually is, based on what your perception and your shuhud of that reality is, what are you doing about it? How are you responding to it? That's how you'll be judged on the day of judgment, because it always goes back to suluk. And how will you be answerable for that? And what knowledge? What knowledge have you obtained from your experience that will benefit you on the day of judgment? Experiential knowledge is highly beneficial, so we can say that they're all beneficial in some way. Um, it would seem to me that a non-dualist perspective is preferable to him, but also one cannot take a naive understanding of a non-dualist perspective, because he asks this question when he goes on his Mi'raj. He has his own Mi'raj. He meets Sayyidina Harun alayhi salam, and then they have a similar discussion about this kind of issue. And then Sheikh Al-Akbar tells Sayyidina Harun, listen, in the Quran, you ask Allah to not let your enemies overpower you or embarrass you, Um, you beg Allah not to let your enemies shame you. Don't let them shame you. So he's like, but you're a knower of God. There's no reality but God. Who's there to shame you? Well, why did you say that? Right? So now we're entering into kind of a dualism. So Sayyidina Harun says, yeah, okay, it's true. There is no reality but God, and we have finafillah, there's nothing but God. But listen, the seekers of God who say that there's nothing but God, okay, how did they arrive at that realization? They did some kind of dhikr, some kind of meditation. What did they use to do meditation? They sat on the floor, the back is against the wall, there's a roof over their head. Those are called the asbab. You did not get rid of the asbab. The asbab did not disappear when you had your enlightenment, when you had your fana. They didn't disappear. So duality, as far as you are concerned, when you're in your body, as far as you're concerned, when you are in your body, you're going to have a dualistic experience of some sort, right? And so that's why he said what he said, even though those other people who wanted to shame him were just manifestations of divine names, right? But the knower, who's a true knower of God, acknowledges the divine presence wherever he sees it. He doesn't say, there's only but God, they're nothing. No, he says, if you're an amateur, he says that. If you're an amateur, sure. But if you're a realized knower, you don't deny anything. There's nothing you deny. Nothing.
Well, that's a beautiful place to close. I want to thank you for your time, and we'll link to your text in the description. I guess in closing, is there anything your next project or your next area of interest that you're working on?
Yes, speaking of Saluk, there's a beautiful book of Saluk called Al-Kitab al-Ajuba al-Arabiya fi Sharh al-Nasa'ih al-Yusufiyya that contains so many like microcosmic seeds of themes that are found in the Futuhat that I think everyone would love to read. I'm translating that. It will take a while, and I'm hoping to get it published sometime by the end of next year, inshallah. So that's about all I'll be working on. And just want to say thank you so much for having me on your podcast. And it's really beautiful talking to a fellow lover of Sheikh Akbar as well. So thank you so much.
And that book that you're translating, it is a book of Sheikh al-Akbar, Ibn Arabi?
It's his. It's his, yes.
Wonderful. And is it that will be the first translation into English?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great gift that you're giving us, and may Allah inspire you and bless that and make it a means of great good. As we mentioned, we'll link to this book for anyone who is interested. I know Braille books, academic books tend to be somewhat expensive usually, which isn't your choice, but if
Yes.
people can get a hold of it, or at least maybe find it in a local library, universities, inshallah, we'll have it as well. But I'm really grateful. I'm hoping that these couple hours for those will be just a bit to get a taste of all that is explored there, and inshallah, a taste of the great universe of Ibn Arabi. So thank you for being our guide through that universe today, and we look forward to having you on again, inshallah.
Jazakallah khairan. Thank you so much, Sidi. It was nice talking to you. And Allah barak feek.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for listening to Path and Present. Path and Present is a podcast that is community supported. If you like these conversations and want to see them spread far and wide and want to become a patron of this podcast, you can visit our Patreon at patreon.com/pathandpresent. And there are various tiers where you can support this podcast. $5 a month makes you a supporter of the path and gives you a personalized thank you note from myself. $20 a month makes you a seeker of wisdom and gives you access to a bunch of bonus material, including unreleased episodes and sessions from previous Rumi Center courses and retreats. $50 a month, you join Baraka's book club, where I share reflections on my favorite books. There's always a book of the month, and we get to reflect upon it. And of course, many of the authors featured in this podcast are some of the authors of my favorite books. So we get to dive deep on that and read together. For $100 a month, you join the Sustainer Circle, and you get a personalized shout out in an episode. And also, we have a monthly Zoom Q&A and discussion for those in the Sustainer Circle. It's an intimate group of like-minded seekers, and you also get access to everything in the previous tiers. So I want to, again, thank you for listening. Of course, like and subscribe and share with friends and family who you think might be interested. And if you want to see these conversations continue, please visit us at patreon.com/pathandpresent. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.